Ian, thank you so much for joining us once again here on Celtics Beat.
Larry, great to talk to you. It's become a bit of a tradition for us, which is nice. And with the NFL season coming up, this is always a fun time to chat about what's on the horizon.
Yeah, especially on Labor Day weekend, which for you is, for everybody, is sort of like everybody's final getaway weekend here for the summer. But final weekend with a little more flexibility in your life, so happy you can spend it with us.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Normally this time of year I'm knee-deep in the tennis world, but based on the histrionics of television, the CBS Tennis Channel gig that I've had over the last 11, 12 years with CBS and maybe 4 or 5 with Tennis Channel no longer is there. ESPN's got all the rights to the U.S. Open, which is fantastic for them. They do an excellent job. But on a personal level, yeah, it's been hard not being out there. It's been a big part of my life, big part of my broadcast life. Still doing the French Open for Tennis Channel. Been doing that the last 9 years. But a little strange not being out in Flushing and taking in the action like I do every year.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into your other endeavors a little later in the show. But this is Celtics Beat, basketball show. Definitely have to start off with pretty much the obvious. People who most identify you with is voice of the new books. Oh, I got myself there. Okay.
You owe me a buck. You owe me a buck.
My dad was still calling the Colts, the Baltimore Colts, like 15 years after they moved, and this was even before like the Ravens were even there, and it'd be like they're playing ball, like who, but voice
I'm sure you would say to your dad, like, hey, you gotta get with the times. Enough of the Baltimore Colts, and here you are. You were on the brink of saying New Jersey Nets.
I know. Hey, Marv Albert, actually, your colleague, I think, even said Baltimore Colts on air like 2 or 3 years ago. So, I mean, this was like 30 years. It's one thing if you say it like a few years after. But anyways, Ian Eagle, voice of the Brooklyn Nets. Let's start with the Nets. That's obviously very easily. A lot of people, and I hate sort of the sweeping generalization, the fame. Some people say when they're discussing the media, but I do look at many of these forecasts. I personally draw my own conclusions, but before we get into any roster breakdowns and offseason moves, and of course, Brooklyn did let a big name go, a move in which you predicted in a way earlier this summer. Anyways, before we get into that, seems that there is this general consensus out there that the Nets will take another step back, likely even fall out of the playoff picture in the Eastern Conference.
I think the general feeling from the Nets' point of view, Larry, has been they needed to address their lack of flexibility more than anything else. They went for it, which you applaud ownership for spending the money, for taking some chances, taking some risks, but you also have to know that there are repercussions, and it didn't turn into a championship. The best this team did was get to the second round of the playoffs, did that with a first-round victory over the Toronto Raptors, where Paul Pierce played such a huge role in that, and then following that run, which ended in the second round, lost to the Miami Heat, they made some changes and determined that they had to go in a different direction, but still had basically the core group of what they had the prior year. And as we know, that ended in a first-round playoff loss to the Atlanta Hawks. Played them in a tough series, 6 games, and showed some heart and showed some improvement over the course of the year. Certainly played better at the back end of the season compared to the early part of the season with a new head coach. And then at the end of this past season, had to make some larger scope decisions for the future of the team, the finances of the team, and the direction of the team. They got a lot younger. That was a big goal. They have lost some of the veteran, quote-unquote, leadership that was supposed to lead this team on to the next chapter. And they have really put a lot of their faith in a combination of players that they believe can be part of a core group moving forward that can show improvement. But if you're asking whether or not, looking at this roster now compared to the roster that they had to start last season, if they feel like it's the same expectation, no, it can't be. They have too many young players that are unproven to make this determination that they're ready to continue on the path that they were going. They they have to figure out exactly who they are, what their identity is going to be, and Lionel Hollins is also going to have to figure out which guys he can rely on, because they're a bunch of young guys that just haven't done it at this level consistently enough to say that you can expect it from them.
Yeah, I was actually reading a few of your quotes when you had that radio interview back in June, and one of the things you mentioned that while they did have a good playoff series against the Hawks, they did have a good back end of the season. I actually remember vividly. I think there was a game, the Celtics, they came at the beginning of April. And They came in there on a Monday night, and they rolled them up, and I was like, oh, geez, they're done. And they ended up playing very well. They really rode Brook Lopez towards the end, and they really developed chemistry. But I remember you sort of said that the chemistry for the majority of that season really just wasn't there until like that final 2 weeks of the season. Do you think with maybe moving some of the faces that they end up moving, it could create a little more of an urgency amongst certain players on the roster, thus increasing probably the chemistry of the team?
Yeah. Larry, I think everybody's kind of jumped on this Darren Williams thing, and rightfully so. He's getting paid a lot of money. He was supposed to be the player that they were building around. They felt that when they made that deal with the Utah Jazz, that they acquired a player that would have multiple All-Star appearances and had a chance to be a Hall of Fame player in the NBA. He was being mentioned in the same sentences as Chris Paul, who is going to be a Hall of Famer one day when his career is done. And Darren was on that career path. Well, with the additional scrutiny comes additional responsibility. And with Darren, I actually think this will turn out to be a good thing for him and his career. He needed a change of scenery. The idea that he gets to go back home, we'll find out whether or not that turns out to be a good fit. But he needed something different in his career. It wasn't working out. Behind the scenes, he was not happy. He was not happy where he was. He was not happy with the situation he was in. And I know from the outside looking in, somebody would say, well, wait a second, you're making $20 million a year, you're living in New York City, you're in the biggest media market in the country, what's not to be happy about? Well, that's more of an individual situation that nobody can truly analyze unless you're in their shoes. He was not content, and the team was not content. It was a relationship that unfortunately went sour. So you could either continue with it if you're the Nets and say, well, we owe this guy so much money and we don't really have a better option at point guard, so let's stick it out. Or you can make the decision that they made, which was let's move on from this, let's offer the buyout, let's stretch it out so it doesn't take as large a hit cap-wise as it could if it was just a straight buyout. And let's turn the page with a new head coach. And while we don't have a player, if this is from the Nets' perspective, that has the same skill set as Darren Williams, it leaves open competition at that point guard spot. And maybe now it creates an opportunity for others to lead.
Yeah, I definitely want to actually touch you briefly upon Darren. It's amazing how you mentioned how at one point, I mean, it seems almost laughable to say it, but at one point, like you're right, he was a shoo-in first ballot Hall of Famer, but yeah, around 2009, 2010, there was an argument that he was the best point guard in the NBA, and now it's sort of like how Bill Simmons has Reggie Cleveland All-Stars with making the jokes about names. You have, I guess, Ken Griffey Hall of Famers, where I guess, well, obviously Griffey, it's unfair because he had some extra terrestrial things that he couldn't control, but you have these guys, the first 26, 27 years old.
Right.
People are already ordaining them, and then you think they're going to keep getting better, but then the back end of the career, it really just isn't there, and that probably is going to be the case for Darren Williams. He could easily finish his career in the NBA, and it's bizarre it is talking about him wrapping up his career, and he has been in the league 10 years, but you could talk about finishing his career pretty much as a journeyman.
Yeah, he could. I mean, he could be one of those guys that bounces around over the last few years. It takes the veterans minimum to squeeze out another year. Here's the one thing that I do know on the Darren side, and I say this with a lot of confidence. If he's not passionate about it anymore, he's not going to just hang around. He's made a lot of money. I think he's been a smart businessman with that money. And with that said, There have probably been some moments where he has looked in the mirror and said, I don't love what I'm doing. And again, I know from the outside looking in, some would say, well, what are you talking about? You're playing in the Premier League in the world. You're making ridiculous amounts of money. You're a known entity. You're growing family, all of that. The world is your oyster. But you can't get inside human beings' heads and analyze what's going on. He will not. This would be my sense. He will not be the guy that squeezes out extra years just to say he played X number of seasons in the NBA. If this doesn't go well in Dallas, Darren could hang him up and move on with his life and try to live in a bit more of anonymity. And it wouldn't shock me at all.
That's actually good to hear, too. I mean, from a personal standpoint, not obviously him hanging it up, but, I mean, you mentioned, obviously, he's kept himself in good financial condition because, I mean, the stories are endless of players who make X millions of dollars and then 3 years out of their league, like a complete mess. But I want to talk about, obviously, from what you said back in June regarding Darren when he was still on the team, you also mentioned Joe Johnson. His name has been floating around in trade rumors. I mean, how does the situation there with Joe Johnson is the Nets, and if you will, unpredict that working out?
Yeah, I think they look at Joe as one of the guys that younger players can learn from. He works as hard as anybody. He takes it incredibly seriously, and while he may not emote a great deal out on the court, and sometimes even behind the scenes, he's reserved. He cares. And that comes across every practice, every shoot-around, every game day. It matters a lot to him. And because of that, yeah, they're paying a large number this year. They're not going to just hand Joe Johnson and give him away. I know there's some salary cap ramifications involved. They were not shopping him nearly as hard as I think people thought they were. My sense is his name was floated out there. If somebody blew them away with an offer, of course, you're going to take it. But they go into this season with the feeling that Joe Johnson's still an important cog. And whether that's starting, I've heard rumors that maybe they would consider a bench role. I don't know if Joe would actually like that, but developing a sixth-man role where maybe he does go up against some second-teamers and then you bring him into the fourth quarter as a closer. There's no doubt they have to monitor his minutes. His minutes were too high last year, and his matchups were often very punishing on his body. He was playing against opposing power forwards at times when they would go a bit smaller, and that was based on the roster and based on Lionel Holland's matchup strategies. And I don't know if he can take that kind of physical toll once again on his body like he did last year. For Paul Pierce, ironically, and that's a guy that we've talked about a great deal in all of our conversations, Larry, it helped him a lot. It really gave him new life in that stretch four role. With Joe Johnson, I don't think he wants it. I don't think he wants to do it. I don't think he wants to bang with these guys. He doesn't want to find himself in the post trying to anchor down and hold off guys that are 6'9", 240 pounds, 250 pounds. Joe's well put together, but that takes a toll on you. So the role that he will have moving forward is still one that the Nets believe can be productive. And if this team does not play up to par, then Joe will obviously be a candidate to be traded before the trade deadline, where there's a playoff team that's looking for that one extra piece, that's looking for that one guy that could put them over the top. And Joe could be a difference maker. He's a guy that's willing and able to take and make big shots. He is not the least bit intimidated by the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, obviously. I mean, you obviously did bring up a good point regarding that. I know teams also have been less inclined to make sort of those types of trades. That's why I think these trade deadlines have been far less active than they were, say, I don't know, around the turn of the decade or whatever. But because due to possibly the salary he's making, and not even sure where he even stands contract-wise, because I know he got the big deal from Atlanta, 5 years ago now? That's about up, right?
Yeah, this is it. Yeah,
this is it.
He is in the year of the deal.
Here. How about, this is going to be an incredibly general question, but how about the mindset of the organization? Because you mentioned about the long-term flexibility. What is, in your words, to best describe it, sort of the mindset of the organization when it comes to fielding a team this year and where that stands with a long-term plan, knowing the franchise's lack of flexibility, for lack of a better word, of that matter?
Yeah, I think it's probably two-pronged. No doubt that unlike some teams, they have to be aware of where they fit into the marketplace because of the New York Knicks, because of all the choices in the New York tri-state area for fans and the options that they have. The marketing of the team is a big part of who they are. When they moved from New Jersey to Brooklyn, nobody really knew what to expect, and that includes yours truly. I had no idea how the borough would react to this team. Would they adopt it as their own? Would there be a feeling out process? Would there be Knicks fans who all of a sudden changed their allegiances and became Nets fans? Would the Jersey people come with them to Brooklyn? How would it all play out? It's been very successful from that standpoint. So you've got two arms trying to work in unison here with the basketball side and with the business side. And that's true for every sports team, don't get me wrong. But for this one in particular, there is a need to stay relevant every single year. And that's where you could get into some trouble when you're making basketball decisions that might be swayed by the business and marketing side of things. They have to be aware of it. They are. There's no doubt that they are sending out the message to the New York basketball fan that this team has a chance to be young and exciting, and you can grow with them. The problem that they'll have, unlike the Boston Celtics, is the limited options and draft picks over the next few years. That's where you can make some quicker fixes, or you can feel as if you're dealing with the future. And the Nets have been dealing basically with the here and now. They need a couple of these young guys to hit and to stick, whether it is Shane Larkin, whether it is Thomas Robinson, whether it's Hollis Jefferson. Some of these young guys have to be legitimate players. I'm not saying stars, but impact players, guys that they can rely upon. Their margin of error is just a bit slimmer based on the fact that they don't have those draft picks in their back pocket to rely on if this season or next season or the year after goes awry.
Yeah, that's a good comment you made, too, regarding New York franchises and how it is almost a double-edged sword. It's like, yeah, you get the lifestyle living in New York, the great economy, all the things that you can do. But it is sort of like kind of what kept the Mets and the Knicks, for that matter, in the garbage can, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, for so long, because it was constantly of fielding a team this year. You got to get on the back pages, blah, blah, blah. So, you hope, for that matter, that that's not something that, gets in the mind of the Nets when it comes to really constructing a team.
Yeah, and I think if you try to be honest and forthright about it, there are certain teams, the Giants, the Yankees, the Rangers, the Knicks, that have the built-in fan base. Not to say that the fans don't expect success. They do. But for the most part, they're still going to get strong crowds year in, year out. The Knicks last year were brutal. But when you went in there for a Knicks game, it was still packed. People showed up because they had paid for the seats. It's very corporate, and your corporations are giving them away, and people are still looking at it as an event. It's Madison Square Garden. Ranger games, I think a similar feel to some degree. NHL is a little bit different. It's apples and oranges in comparing the reaction of the fans. But for the most part, it's still the team that you associate with New York. So with all of that said, Giants as well, when you're the Mets, when you're the Islanders, when you're the Devils, when you're the Nets, when you're the Jets, you have to work a little bit harder. And the marketing side comes into play. And we've seen it now, the Mets as an example, what they've done this year, building young pitchers, young talent, an occasional free agent signing here and there, but being efficient. And it's not easy if you're a fan of that team going through the process. The payoff could turn out to be one of the great stretches in franchise history if they're able to keep all those young pitchers together. But going out to Citi Field over the course of that evolution process was not always a party. It was dark. A lot of those nights, it was very dark. So how do you balance that? And I think that's what the teams that we just mentioned have to deal with oftentimes, unlike in a Boston or another major city where the fan base is so robust and there are no other options. There is a lack of competition, so maybe those teams, those marquee teams, don't have to worry about it like the teams that we just mentioned.
Yeah, it makes for a good case study because you mentioned the Mets with the young pitchers, and if you even want to talk about baseball and everything, you go back to the early 90s when Steinbrenner was out of baseball and they didn't have the pressure of, we got to get on the back pages every single day.
Right.
And they built those great teams. They were allowed to keep those guys, and they weren't trading, Jay Buhner for what? The famous Seinfeld scene or whatever. But same thing. I mean, you look at, say, the Knicks every year or back especially, in the 2000s when they were fielding these just goofball teams with, Zach Randolph and Steve Francis, and it was making you laugh. But it's showing it like the Mets and the Yankees when, they fight, actually stick with the plan and don't get caught up in the storm or just this whole, it's almost like, when Stephen A. Smith, and I don't want to specifically mention him because, but I get it. You see him like most. Like the Knicks will lose some like random regular season game in December by 30. And he said, this is a disgrace to New York. And it's just like a guy getting on his high horse. It's like, okay, this is the only thing that happens in New York. But that sort of creates like a firestorm and like it doesn't seem it. You don't think people are that adhered to it, but it creates a firestorm and, they get the fans riled up and the fans start pressuring people. And then all of a sudden that may sway management into making short-sighted decisions. And that really does happen in New York.
Yeah, when I broke into the business in 1990 when I graduated Syracuse and I started working at WFAN radio as a producer. And looking back on that time, I thought it, and now it's been validated when I try to analyze how the business has changed and how it's affected teams. Sports radio changed so much of our sports culture. That instant reaction, no longer did you have to wait for the newspaper the next morning to read the back pages. You could get a sense of what the fans felt, or at least what the callers felt, instantly, right after an event. And throughout the day, you could take the temperature of the fans, their opinions on teams, managers, players, general managers, owners. That had just not been available. It was based on letters to the editor. That's how we would try to determine exactly what people felt, or going to your local bar and hanging out for an hour and a half and just talking sports with people. That was it. So sports radio changed the business, and I think owners of teams and towns that had sports radio started reacting to it, and GMs, all of that. Then, as time has gone on, what we've seen with the Internet now is just another level. What Twitter has done, giving fans instant access. They have their own talk show every moment of every day. They've got their own place, their own forum to give their opinions and to share them, and sometimes to share them directly with the person or team that they are talking about. So I do think you get a lot of very drastic reactions, oftentimes based on a small sample size, but that's the power. That was the power of sports radio. That is now the power of social media. And because of that, alluding to what you just said, yes, you can get the little boy who cried wolf. That can have an impact. That can have an impact on what a team is thinking and what the strategy is. The challenge is for those teams to block out the noise, take in the reaction and the constructive criticism that's real, and block out some of the stuff that just becomes white noise after a while, and run the operation the way you believe is the right way to run it. There are going to be pitfalls, there are going to be hurdles, there are going to be people that are pissed off, there are going to be people that are criticizing your every move. But in the end, can you look deep within yourself and say, this is the way it's got to be done, and I can't worry about all of the stuff that's coming at me from all of the angles. I got to do it the right way. Look, it goes both ways. There are times where you've got to listen to your fan base, and you've got to gauge and use it as a barometer. But it can't be a minute-by-minute assessment of, are we doing the right thing?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the extreme benefits that the Celtics have. It's incredible. I mean, they've been down. Well, they had obviously that poor year first with Brad Stevens, but throughout this rebuilding process now for the 2 years, the general consensus amongst fans is there isn't a minute-by-minute reaction. First off, hey, I do this show once a week. I think that's tremendously benefit. I'm actually able to analyze the games without even the emotions of me as a fan who wants to see the Celtics win.
Sure.
If you do it, say, I do this show every Sunday as opposed to after every single game. It's, it gives you that time to reflect. But one of the benefits the Celtics have had in this rebuilding, I think, is there's almost no pressure on the front office. And no matter what people say, that the front office and ownerships feel pressure from fans, or especially the general managers, because they know, hey, if their job's on the line. But I do want to discuss, because we always seem to get off track too whenever we talk, because we don't have having fun. So we definitely want to ask one more question on the Nets, because there's so much stuff I would like to get to. But I'm going to finish this off with probably the stupidest question I'll ask you. And I know I'm not the first, but do you think that the Nets, when they go about constructing their team this past summer and going forward in the immediate future, do they have the draft picks they owe Boston and previously Atlanta in mind? Almost like, letting if some of the emotions, for that matter, get in the way of how it could potentially really sting if the Nets have to continue to deconstruct the roster in a way, continue to fall further and down the ladder, and then proceed to hand over the 5th, 6th, 7th pick in the draft? Or is it like being a cold-blooded stock trader who has no issue selling a stock at a loss, moving on, clean your hands? Do you think that's the feeling of the Nets?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. Just knowing Billy King and knowing the way that he operates. He's a very competitive guy, shrewd, but competitive. And I do think that when the ownership group took over, there was a sense of go for broke. There's no way that Billy was able to make the moves that he made, Pierce, Garnett, Joe Johnson, Darren Williams, without the backing of ownership. They felt they had a chance to make a splash. They tried to construct a roster that could compete for a championship, and ultimately fell short of that, fell well short. It wasn't as if they were even in the conversation. They weren't. But they felt that they had pieces in place that could at least compete at a higher level than they had been competing, and they gave up a lot to get it. With that said, you do have to pay the piper, and you can't make your roster decisions based solely on what's good for this moment only. You do need to keep the future in mind. I don't think that they've been scared or hesitant to pull the trigger on anything based on the fact that they're going to still owe all of these draft picks. They are attempting to craft a roster that could grow, and the youth part is the biggest key. They were older with KG, with Pierce. They were an older team, one of the oldest in the NBA. They've changed that. They've changed it quickly. Not all of these moves are going to be home runs. They never are. But they got to hit a couple doubles here. They need some base hits to see if some of these guys can survive it and be a part of this for the future. Chris McCullough, as an example, kid out of Syracuse, looked like he had first-round talent, had the terrible ACL injury, questions as to whether or not he would even be drafted, let alone be drafted in the first round. I think the Nets looked at him and said, this is an opportunity to get a player that, if he was healthy, might have been a top 15, top 12 pick. So while they made the acquisition of Hollis Jefferson in the Portland deal, they got themselves another player that could have been a first-round draft pick a year from that draft, the 2016 draft. They're trying to get creative. They believe he can play this year, but they believe that if given the chance to develop his skills, he could have been in that first-round conversation in the top half of the first round a year later. So that was a case of trying to get young quickly and do it with some guys that have some upside. And although it's risk, and it is, it's a calculated risk that they needed to take based on their draft status over the next 3 years.
Yeah, we talked about many of the detriments of playing in New York. That is obviously one of the positives. There's going to be a little bit more of that revenue to throw around to maybe make some catch-up moves. And you obviously, too, you mentioned how, hitting doubles and base hits or whatnot, hit a couple double base hits, those still add up to runs because you mentioned roster flexibility, or I mentioned it for that matter. You can end up packaging those guys and keep upgrading your talent. But I want to move off from the Nets because as identifiable you are with the Nets, you're equally as visible on CBS, especially us from a national standpoint, with the NFL and, of course, college basketball, March Madness. It seems like ancient history now. Those Butler teams made runs, 2011 and 12, I think, back-to-back title games. And Brad Stevens was being acknowledged as possibly the best coach in the game, no high poll then. And he makes the jump to the NBA in 13, and a lot of people were high on him then. When you watched him in college, did you think he'd work out when he first came over, or has he actually exceeded what you thought of him? Because I remember you giving him high praise to me this past season as Boston made their playoff push.
Yeah, I had Butler a couple of times during his run there, and that included their run to the NCAA championship game. I was doing the World Feed with Pete Gillen, former Providence head coach, back then, and they nearly pulled it off. They came within an eyelash of winning that game, and it would have been the greatest upset, not only in college basketball history, but in my mind, it might have been the greatest upset in sports history, all things considered. I was blown away when I sat down with him. I did a game with Bill Raftery. I think it was Indiana Butler at what was then Conseco, and now they've changed the name since then. It's Banker's Life. And I walked away from the meeting. I turned to Bill and said, my goodness, this guy is ridiculously sharp. And Raph turned back to me. He's met everybody. He's talked to everybody. He's been doing this forever. And he said, this guy is special. So to get that stamp of approval from Bill, and then to back it up, Jim Spanarkel and I had him, what turned out to be his final college game at Butler in the NCAA tournament in 2013 before getting the Celtic job. And Jimmy had never met him. And I told Jim what I thought ahead of time, and Jim has been doing this a long time himself, and he's met with all these guys throughout the years. We did 16 NCAA tournaments together, 17 NCAA tournaments together. And I told him what I thought, but Jim's his own man, and we sat down with him, and Spanarkel walked away afterwards and said, boy, you were not kidding. My goodness. You're used to the coach talk. You're used to the way in which coaches handle those meetings. Brad is genuinely a true basketball aficionado. It comes across when you sit down with him. He's an excellent communicator. He has the ability to make guys better. And ultimately, and I know things have kind of gotten misinterpreted through the years. Oh, it's so tough to coach pros compared to college guys, and that's why college coaches never make great NBA head coaches. That's not the reason why. The guys in the pros want to get better. They want to improve. Why? Why do they want to get better? Well, that means a better contract. That means more stability. That means more money. That means a higher profile. These guys want to work on their skills if they're being coached correctly. And I think what Boston got in the brilliant move that Danny Ainge made was a guy that can do this forever. The only questions with him will be whether or not one of these big-time jobs college jobs come across his lap, and whether he would jump back in based on the fact you run the show. There's no doubt about it. Mike Krzyzewski is the CEO of Duke. And if the opportunity was there for Brad Stevens to be the CEO of Duke, would that be too alluring to turn down?
Yeah, that's sort of what I know he's sort of pushed it away, and I do think that he's honest, especially that there have been plenty of sources close to him. But you're right, if a job like that does come up, and I also think the big thing is, as successful as he's been early on, and I would consider him making the postseason last year, 40 and 42, as a tremendous success, because I thought for the majority of that season it was a 25-win team.
Agreed.
But I mean, if he's constantly dealing with the young guys, managing minutes, and he's not getting, a team. It's sort of like, geez, how long am I going to be doing this? Because it obviously can detract eventually from your own profile as well. It's where, insiders such as yourself and even someone who follows the Celtics as closely as I do, we can praise them all we want, but you're in this obviously to gain accolades, and if you're, just fighting for playoff spots every year, eventually, year 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it's going to be like, oh, geez, I'd like to, do something else if this isn't going to happen. I mean, I love the Celtics thing, but that's how I feel.
Yeah. Hey, look, he wants to win titles. I don't think he's happy with just getting recognition that he's done a good job in the NBA. You don't take the Boston Celtics job with the idea, well, this will be a filler job until something else comes along. That's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But I think a lot of it will be based on how this roster comes together and the success that they have. If this team is ultra successful and he's got a chance to compete for championships, I don't think Brad Stevens is going to go anywhere. But if it is a team that hovers and Danny Ainge keeps reshuffling the deck and they don't seem to develop the kind of team that the hope was when they put it up on the drawing board, then the options are going to be there. Brad Stevens is going to coach for a long time. He's going to be a head coach for a long time, whether it's going to be in the NBA or it's going to be college basketball at one of the premier programs. That's without a doubt. That's not a statement that that we would consider outlandish by any stretch. He's going to be a 25-year, 30-year head coach just based on his age alone. He can do this for a long time. The questions will be where, and then family-oriented. Where do you want to lay down your roots? Where do you want to make your family feel at home? Geographically, that'll probably be the next question that comes about once he gets through this phase of his Boston Celtic head coaching career. Does it become a 20-year job with the Celtics, or does he end up going somewhere else to fulfill another part of whatever he throws out there as the challenge in his evolving coaching life?
That's sort of what I have been, discussing on the show on prior shows, and when I've broken down the Celtics roster so much is they're into actually year 3, the rebuilding, and they have really been shuffling pieces around. And even though it isn't about, say, shuffling the deck and collecting assets or whatnot, he really hasn't had a consistent team or rotation really to build upon. Even if it isn't going to produce, say, a championship, it's at least a team you can attach to, and it isn't just constantly managing minutes and managing personalities as it has been the last 2 years. And that's actually one of the reasons why I have been a little bit concerned with it doing. To support what Danny Ainge has been doing, absolutely. I think the team is in good shape. I do think it's going to work out at the end. But going into the season, that's sort of what I've been saying, because I think they should really elevate the goals. I think that if they do finish 40 and 42 again, I think it is somewhat of a success, knowing that that's now the threshold from last season. But I just want to see a little continuity from the roster, because I think it's unfair to him to constantly put pressure on him as opposed to managing teams. Now, we've had you here for a little bit. I wanted to obviously discuss, once again, many other endeavors you do, but I've brought this up a lot, and I think this is very relevant because you're in New York, and there was almost a contrived rivalry, in my opinion, 2 years ago when the Nets moved to Brooklyn. It was sort of like, we need to create a geographical rivalry in the NBA. It really doesn't exist in the NBA. You look at the NFL, Bears, Packers, all those divisional rivalries, Yankees, Red Sox. And one of the reasons why, I think, is because the regular season seems to mean less and less every year. Now you're hearing cries because say the Celtics and the Nets get in the playoffs last year under 500, and these other teams out west, they don't get in the playoffs, seeded 1-16. I think that would make things worse in terms of the regular season. How would you feel about that if, 1-16? And at the same time, do you agree that there really aren't many good geographical rivalries in the NBA the way there is in every other professional sports league?
No, I think rivalries are cyclical in the NBA based on how many times you meet a team in the postseason, what's at stake, how many players remain, not just over a short time, but that can bridge a couple of eras. That to me is what usually will get the rivalries going. And they come and go based on the way that the teams come and go. If you're not a good NBA team, then odds are you're not going to be a rival of anybody. The Sacramento Kings are not a rival of the Golden State Warriors because they're pretty close geographically. Sacramento hasn't been good enough to be a rival. They went through the one stretch when they had Peja and they had Divac and they had Weber and they had a chance to go to the NBA Finals and should have gone to the NBA Finals. Actually, the year the Nets
beat the Celtics.
Exactly. That's the year that Sacramento should have been in the finals, should have been Sacramento and the New Jersey Nets at the time. And while it may not have done a rating on network television, it would have been much more competitive than the Lakers and the Nets, which turned out to be a 4-game sweep. But I think it seems like an easy fix to people that, okay, enough with the divisions, enough with the conferences. Let's just rank them 1 through 16, and that's going to alleviate the problem. It's not. It's not going to alleviate the problem. There's no possible way to play a completely balanced schedule in the NBA just based on the sheer geography of what we're talking about. The travel itself, it can't be done. So to me, just because last year went the way that it did, or the last couple of years in the Eastern Conference has been so top-heavy, doesn't mean that you now react and overreact to make that kind of sweeping change to the NBA playoff format. Is it perfect? It isn't. Are there good teams that get left out? Yes. But guess what? There'd be good teams that got left out in a 1 through 16 ranking as well. That's just the nature of the beast. To me, that's not worth making that kind of adjustment, and I don't think Adam Silver is going to do it when push comes to shove. He's a bright guy, really sharp. I think they've looked at it, they've studied it. They're not going to have a knee-jerk reaction based on what happened last year. These things come and go. What's the formula to win an NBA title these days, Larry? The formula is, if you're the Golden State Warriors, draft well, add some pieces, get some steals here and there. That's what happened with Draymond Green. Obviously, they hit a grand slam with Steph Curry. Thompson turned out to be the right pick. They had enough role players, and it all worked. The head coach fit. It all worked. It was the perfect storm. Prior to that, when we were watching a team like Miami win championships, well, they had one of the best players ever in LeBron James. He raised the level of play. They had other studs in that lineup. It came together nicely. It didn't happen overnight, but it eventually did happen. The San Antonio Spurs, one of the all-time greats in Tim Duncan, and the fact that he is a team guy and team harmony, listening to their head coach. These things don't happen by accident. They're not easy to construct. So the idea that the NBA is set up in a way that there are teams that are going to be upset that they don't make the NBA playoffs. I understand in the grand scheme it costs you financially, it costs you perception-wise, all of that in the Western Conference, which was so competitive. But that's not nearly enough to change a format that has proven to be the right format for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, if I would argue anything, I think that they need to even, make winning the division mean even more. Yes, it could be a little bit unfair, but I think it would make the regular season for all these other teams far more intriguing because let's say the Celtics play the Knicks 6 to 8 times as opposed to 4. That just creates, I think, just a better rivalry, and most importantly, it's more fair to you guys who obviously travel with the teams. One, I'll never be a reporter. I would never do these goofball West Coast trips or anything, but it's more fair to you guys, and I just think it would be better rivalry-wise, and if you also, you're an NFL guy, we got to get into that, too, before we wrap this thing up. One of the example I use was it 2010? The Seahawks went 7-9, and they got a home game, and they played the 12-4 Saints, and they beat them. And everyone's like, "Oh, that was unfair." So here we are 5 years ago. No one cares. I mean, I have to mention that, and it's just like, and no one cares because it had no impact on who wins the championship. Same thing as last year, or the year when the Phoenix Suns won like 49 games or whatever. The Miami Heat or the Spurs or whatever, they would have won the championship no matter what. So it really has no impact on any historical implications in the NBA. And
yeah, the hard part, Larry, when you bring the NFL into the equation, the NFL has one thing going for it that no other league can say, and that is every single year somebody emerges that you never in your wildest dreams thought would be a playoff contender. And that's true every single season. There's a surprise because you can improve your team quickly in the NFL if you get the right quarterback. If a guy surpasses his expectations as a rookie at a skill position, he can have that kind of impact on the game. In the NBA, that's hard to do. It's hard. In baseball, it's hard to do. It takes years. NHL, maybe a little bit easier. You get some surprises here and there. For the most part, you can look before the season and say, this looks like a playoff team, this looks like a playoff team, this doesn't look like a playoff team. And your percentage would be fairly high. In the NFL, the injuries play such a large role, as we know, and the quarterback position plays such a large role. One guy has so much power, unlike the other sports. So I see your point. I do believe that there is something to be said for divisional rivalries. If you look in the NFL, that's really where their bread and butter is. You get up for your divisional opponents. I don't know if the NBA could ever truly create that. They've gone away from that, if anything, over the last number of years. And I'm not sure that there's a plan in place to try to re-emphasize what those divisional games mean and changing the divisional winner and how that fits into the overall playoff landscape. It's something they really have to look at. I don't think it's broke. I know some people think it is. I don't think it's broken. I don't know if it necessarily needs to be fixed, but it does leave open the potential criticism from NBA people that will use this past year as an example of unfairness, where quality Western Conference teams didn't get in, and teams in the Eastern Conference that were sub-500 did.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned really the NFL with the rivalries, and this is what I really point to, too. I mean, the Patriots could be playing the 4-7 Jets at one point in the season. It's, oh, my goodness, the Jets are in town, blah, 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 blah. But we definitely, we're going to let you be going here. But if you want to spoil this, if you're allowed to, where will you be week 1 next Sunday for the NFL, if you're allowed to say that?
Oh, yes, I'm very much allowed to say. In fact, we have our first 8 games in stone. First time ever in my 18 years at CBS. I know where I'm going the first 8 weeks of the year. Week 1 is Miami at Washington, walking right into the quarterback controversy with the Redskins and dealing with it head on. Week 2, San Diego at Cincinnati. Week 3, San Diego at Minnesota. Week 4, Jets at Miami in London. Week 5, St. Louis at Green Bay. Week 6, Denver at Cleveland. Week 7, the Jets and the New England Patriots.
There you go.
And Week 8, Cincinnati and Pittsburgh.
That's a good stretch. Of course, number 2 man. That was last year you got the bump, and we were all pumped for you. But Ian, thanks so much for taking the time to join us on Celtics Beat. You spent a lot of time with us, but as always, hope we did you justice.
Oh, always, Larry. Really enjoyable conversation. Always enjoy when we get to chat, and I hope you enjoyed your summer. Good luck in the transition of the NBA coming back. I know it's an exciting time, and I know Boston loves what you do, so keep it up.
Thank you very much, and good luck to you as well on CBS, and of course, the NBA season now not too far away, but Ian Eagle, voice of the Brooklyn Nets in CBS Sports. Thanks so much once again, Ian. We appreciate it.
All right, Larry. We'll talk soon, man.